In episode 105, titled Decryption Rules, When Inspection is Required and Common Pitfalls, we treat decryption rules as the control surface that decides which traffic gets inspected, because transport layer security inspection is only safe and defensible when scope is intentional. Transport layer security, often shortened to TLS after first mention, hides content by design. So decryption rules define when you intentionally regain visibility and when you deliberately preserve end-to-end privacy. The exam tends to test that you understand decryption is not an all-or-nothing switch, but a policy decision shaped by compliance requirements, threat exposure, and operational capacity. When decryption rules are designed well, inspection focuses on high-risk channels and produces useful signals without breaking critical applications or creating privacy overreach. When they are designed poorly, inspection becomes either ineffective because it misses what matters, or disruptive because it intercepts what should never be touched. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Decryption scope can be defined in several practical ways, including by destination, by category, or by application behavior, and each approach has different strengths and trade-offs. Destination-based scope targets specific domains, Internet protocol ranges, or known services, which can be precise when your risk is concentrated in a small set of channels like file-sharing platforms. Category-based scope targets groups of destinations, such as cloud storage, webmail, or newly registered domains, which can be easier to manage but requires confidence in categorization accuracy and ongoing updates. Application-based scope relies on application identification logic to decide what traffic is being carried, which can be valuable when many different services share common ports but still exhibit distinguishable behavior patterns. The exam expects you to understand that scope selection is about control intent, because a scope method that is too broad can cause disruption and privacy concerns, while one that is too narrow can leave major risk channels opaque. In practice, many environments blend these approaches, starting with categories and then tightening with destination and application exceptions, because that creates a manageable policy surface. Decryption is often driven by clear requirements that force visibility into outbound channels, and the common drivers are compliance, malware prevention, and data controls. Compliance can require evidence that sensitive data leaving the organization is monitored and governed, which is difficult when most outbound channels are encrypted. Malware prevention is a driver because encrypted web traffic is a primary delivery path for malicious payloads, and without decryption, content scanning and behavioral rules have limited visibility into what is being downloaded or executed. Data controls include data loss prevention policies that detect sensitive patterns in uploads and form submissions, which generally requires content inspection rather than only destination awareness. The exam usually frames these drivers as legitimate reasons to decrypt, but it also expects you to recognize that requirement-driven scope is safer than blanket decryption because it creates a defensible policy rationale. When you can link the decryption decision to a specific requirement, you can also justify exemptions and logging in a way that aligns with governance and operations. Selective decryption is the correct default approach because it balances privacy and security by focusing inspection where risk and requirements are highest. The goal is to decrypt enough traffic to reduce meaningful risk, such as malware delivery and regulated data leakage, while avoiding unnecessary interception of sensitive personal categories or fragile applications. Selective decryption also reduces performance impact because decryption and inspection consume compute resources and add handshake overhead, so a narrower scope is easier to support reliably. The exam tends to reward the concept of risk-based scope because it shows you understand that security controls must be sustainable and defensible, not only technically possible. Selectivity also supports better alert quality because when you decrypt the most relevant categories, the signals you generate are more likely to correspond to real threats and policy violations. When you design decryption rules as a scoped policy, you create an inspection posture that can be tuned, measured, and maintained over time. Certificate trust is a foundational requirement because decryption relies on clients trusting the enterprise certificate authority that signs the interception certificates, and unmanaged trust creates warnings and unsafe habits. Enterprise routes must be deployed into managed device trust stores so that inspected sessions validate cleanly without prompting users to click through certificate errors. User experience matters because warning fatigue trains unsafe behavior, and once users are trained to ignore warnings, they may ignore real warnings triggered by attacker impersonation attempts. Trust store management must also handle lifecycle, ensuring certificates do not expire unexpectedly, and that revocation and rotation are planned to avoid mass outages. The exam often expects you to connect decryption to certificate governance because inspection changes the trust boundary and introduces an enterprise-controlled intermediary that must be trusted. When certificate trust is managed well, inspection becomes mostly invisible to users, which reduces support load and reduces pressure to bypass security controls. Exception lists exist because some traffic should not be decrypted, either for technical compatibility or for policy reasons. And exceptions are part of correct design rather than a sign of failure. Pinned applications are a common technical exception where certificate pinning causes the application to reject substituted certificates and fail if inspection is attempted. Sensitive services can be policy exceptions, where decryption would create privacy or legal concerns, and these often include categories like health-related services or certain financial interactions depending on organizational policy. Exceptions can also be required for authentication and identity flows that are fragile under interception, particularly when multiple redirect chains and token exchanges are involved. The exam expects you to recognize that exceptions must be documented and controlled because a growing exception list can erode coverage if it is unmanaged, and because exemptions themselves can become blind spots attackers exploit. When exceptions are handled as a governed policy element, they protect user experience and compatibility without turning inspection into Swiss cheese. A scenario that illustrates required decryption is outbound file sharing in a regulated environment where the organization needs to enforce data loss prevention for sensitive data leaving through cloud storage uploads. File sharing services are attractive for legitimate collaboration and for attackers, and they often run over encrypted hypertext transfer protocol Secure, which hides file content from content-aware controls. By decrypting traffic to file-sharing destinations or categories, the organization can inspect uploads for sensitive patterns and apply policy actions such as blocking, quarantining, or alerting depending on classification and destination. This scenario aligns with exam expectations because it ties scope to a specific risk and requirement rather than decrypting everything just in case. It also highlights that decryption rules should be precise enough to cover the relevant upload paths while excluding unrelated browsing traffic that does not carry the same data leakage risk. When the decryption policy is scoped and justified, the organization can meet compliance obligations while keeping performance and privacy impacts manageable. A common pitfall is decrypting identity provider flows and breaking logins, because modern identity systems involve complex redirects, token exchanges, and strict validation behaviors that can be sensitive to interception. Identity providers, spelled out as identity providers on first mention, often rely on consistent transport layer security properties, and interception can trigger validation failures, session confusion, or unexpected prompts that disrupt authentication. Breaking logins is a severe outcome because it affects availability and can quickly force teams to disable inspection broadly, undermining the original security goals. The exam expects you to recognize that identity flows are critical paths and that decryption scope must be designed carefully to avoid intercepting authentication exchanges unless there is a specific, tested requirement to do so. In practice, identity flows are often placed on exception lists or handled with very cautious, narrowly tested policies, precisely because the cost of breaking them is high. When you remember that authentication is a fragile dependency, you avoid policies that cause widespread disruption. Another pitfall is missing capacity planning because decryption and inspection are resource-intensive and can cause latency and dropped sessions when infrastructure cannot keep up. If throughput and CPU headroom are insufficient, the inspection point can become a bottleneck, increasing handshake time, introducing timeouts, and creating a user experience that resembles a network outage. Under load, systems may also fail open or fail closed depending on design, and either mode can be problematic if it is not planned, because fail open can create a visibility gap during peak risk, while fail closed can create an availability incident. The exam tends to test that you understand inspection has performance costs and that capacity must be measured and engineered, not assumed. Capacity planning also includes sizing for peak traffic, concurrent connections, and the overhead of content scanning features like malware detection and data loss prevention, because these add processing beyond basic cryptography. When capacity is planned, inspection remains reliable and does not become the cause of the outage it was meant to prevent. A quick win is measuring throughput and CPU before expanding scope, because data-driven scaling prevents surprise bottlenecks and supports a safe, phased rollout. Measuring includes baseline performance without decryption, performance with limited decryption categories, and then incremental increases while watching latency, handshake failures, and error rates. CPU utilization is a key metric because cryptographic operations scale with connection volume, and content scanning can scale with data volume, so both need headroom. Throughput measurement should include peak business periods and known burst scenarios, because decryption failures tend to appear under peak load when users are most sensitive to disruption. The exam expects you to show this measured approach because it demonstrates operational maturity and reduces the probability that decryption policies will be rolled back due to performance incidents. When you expand scope, only after capacity proves stable, you preserve both security and availability. Operationally, logging decrypted traffic decisions is important for auditing and troubleshooting because decryption rules are policy decisions that must be explainable after the fact. Decision logs should show whether traffic was decrypted or exempted, what rule matched, and what category or destination drove the decision, because that information supports both compliance evidence and incident response. Logging also helps validate that scope is behaving as intended, such as confirming that file sharing is being decrypted while sensitive exempt categories are not. Audit requirements often care less about the content itself and more about whether the organization enforced a documented policy consistently, and decision logs provide that evidence. The exam expects you to connect decryption policy to governance because interception is sensitive and must be justified, monitored, and reviewed. When logs capture decisions clearly, teams can tune scope safely and can answer questions about why certain traffic was or was not inspected. A memory anchor for decryption rules is scope, trust, exceptions, capacity, audit, because it captures the key control dimensions that determine whether inspection is safe and effective. Scope defines what you decrypt and why. Trust defines how clients accept inspection without warning fatigue. And exceptions define what must not be decrypted for compatibility or policy reasons. Capacity ensures the infrastructure can handle the decryption workload without causing latency and dropped sessions, and audit ensures decisions are recorded and defensible. This anchor is useful for exam questions because it provides a structured way to evaluate a proposed policy and identify which dimension is missing. If a scenario mentions broken apps, you think exceptions and trust. And if it mentions slowness, you think capacity, while if it mentions compliance, you think scope and audit. When you use this anchor, you can answer decryption policy questions quickly and coherently. A prompt-style exercise is choosing a decryption policy from constraints, because real environments often have competing goals like compliance coverage, privacy boundaries, and limited infrastructure headroom. If the constraint is strict performance limits, you would scope decryption to the highest risk categories and destinations, and keep exemptions broad enough to preserve critical application compatibility. If the constraint is strict compliance for regulated outbound data, you would ensure that the relevant exfiltration channels, like file sharing and webmail uploads, are decrypted and inspected, while still exempting sensitive personal categories as required by policy. If the constraint is high user friction from certificate issues, you would prioritize trust store management and certificate lifecycle stability before expanding decryption scope, because user warning fatigue undermines security. In each case, the exam expects you to justify scope and exemptions in a way that aligns to the constraints rather than treating decryption as mandatory everywhere. Practicing this selection strengthens the ability to design a policy that is defensible and operable. Episode 105 concludes with the idea that decryption rules are the governing layer that makes inspection usable, because they decide what is decrypted, what is exempt, and how the organization balances visibility with privacy and performance. Requirement drivers like compliance, malware prevention, and data controls justify selective decryption, but success depends on certificate trust management, well-governed exception lists, and solid capacity planning. The key pitfalls are decrypting identity provider flows and breaking logins, and expanding scope without capacity headroom, because both failures quickly lead to disruptive incidents and policy rollback. The scope selection drill rehearsal is to take a set of constraints, map which categories must be decrypted to meet risk and compliance goals, define what must be exempt for privacy and compatibility, and then state what capacity and audit signals you would measure before expanding further. When you can narrate that selection clearly, you demonstrate exam-ready judgment and an operational approach to decryption that is both secure and sustainable. With that mindset, TLS inspection becomes a controlled capability rather than a blunt instrument. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.